Well, welcome to the Meat, Body, and Soul podcast. I am, as usual, Jodelle, and I'm always excited to have a guest come back on after they've been with me before. It's always nice to see that beautiful face again of Dr. Stephanie Seneff, a senior research scientist at MIT and author of the book Toxic Legacy, which, of course, you can order anywhere books are sold. We're going to be talking about that. But Stephanie, thank you for coming back on. You've been a busy lady because I have read several papers you have published that I'm excited to talk about here. And there's so much I wanted to talk about with you today. I'm fascinated by deuterium depletion. I wanted to touch on the fact that even eating a meat-based approach helps one deplete deuterium. And I'm fascinated by your information on taurine. I read about that. I love that on glyphosate and on eating animal fats. And we'll also discuss cancer research because you've been doing a lot of that, including some natural therapies we can talk about. So thank you so much for coming on.
A great introduction, and you can tell I'm thrilled about deuterium. I'm so excited. It's a group of us that are digging into it, and we're getting lots of insight into really metabolism and how things work and how obsessed the body is with maintaining low deuterium in the mitochondria. I think that is central to metabolism, and it's not something people are aware of.
Yeah, and I want to start, with what is deuterium because a lot of people are going to hear this, and if they didn't listen to us before, and maybe they didn't see the podcast I did with Dr. Laszlo Boras, they need to understand what it is before they can sink their teeth into it. So can you explain
Totally.
it to us in layman's terms?
Yeah, it's become
Okay.
to me such a common word that, oh, you don't
Yeah.
know what deuterium is, but
Yeah.
actually it's not that easy a word. Unless you've taken chemistry, you won't really know it.
Sure.
It's actually a natural molecule, natural atom. It's a heavy isotope of hydrogen. You know, you have carbon 12, carbon 14, and they use
Mm.
carbon 14 to label things. It's like carbon 14, but to hydrogen. And so carbon 12 and carbon 14, there's 12 and then there's 14. So it's a little bit heavier. But with hydrogen, when you put hydrogen has one proton and one electron. Deuterium has one proton, one electron, and one neutron. And a neutron is about the same weight as the proton. The proton is much heavier than the electron. So all the weight is basically in the proton. And when you put in an extra neutron, you make it twice as heavy. So hydrogen is the most common atom in the body, in fact, in the universe. And it's the tiniest atom, just one, and carbon has 12, for example, protons. And so hydrogen is super involved in metabolism all over the place. It's crucial. Almost every reaction involves hydrogen.
Mhm.
And deuterium is a natural isotope of hydrogen. It's not radioactive, and it shows up everywhere hydrogen shows up. So it'll bind to a carbon atom instead of hydrogen, and it'll appear pretty much normal, except that there's that extra neutron in there, which messes things up. So it has different behaviors biophysically and biochemically compared to hydrogen. And that makes all the difference in the world. So it's natural. It's not very common compared to hydrogen, but it is common compared to, say, calcium. Because hydrogen is so common, even a small proportion of hydrogen atoms ends up being a lot of atoms of deuterium compared to sort of most of the minerals. It's in the
Mhm.
ballpark of minerals
Okay.
in terms of
So
concentrations.
yeah, when I think of deuterium in the body, I kind of think of it when you say the word heavy, I'm thinking about toxicity, like it weighs down the cells. It's something that bogs down our system, correct?
That's kind of a good analogy. I like to liken it to sugar in the gas tank. When you put
Okay.
sugar in the gas tank, it messes up the engine.
Yeah.
Deuterium, the mitochondria are the workhorses of the cell. They're the ones that make the energy that the cell runs on, the fuel. They make the energy in the form of ATP. They convert ADP to ATP, and it's proton motive force that's used as the energy to do that, to perform that reaction by the
Hmm.
ATPase pumps in the mitochondria. And if you gum up those pumps with deuterium, they have stutters. They get kind of broken down, and when they accumulate enough deuterium, they completely crash. And so the pumps are constantly being made, and then they're being used, and then they wear out because they eventually accumulate too much deuterium. They wear out, and then you've
Hmm.
got to clear them and make some more. So there's a constant process of renewing the mitochondria to keep them healthy. But if you've got more deuterium hanging around in your mitochondria on average, they're going to be dying faster. And if they're
Okay.
dying faster, they're releasing more reactive oxygen. And mitochondria releasing reactive oxygen is a key component of many diseases, including all the neurodegenerative diseases and autism,
Hmm.
Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. All of those have this problem that the neurons, their mitochondria, are releasing too much reactive oxygen, and they're not making enough ATP at the same time. So it's sort of like it's running inefficiently. The pumps are running inefficiently, and then they're not performing adequately in terms of their production, but they're also producing these reactive oxygen products that are damaging everything, damaging the DNA in the mitochondria, ending up, that can lead you to cancer. There's all kinds of diseases that come out of mitochondrial dysfunction. You really can read a lot of papers talking about mitochondrial dysfunction as a core feature of all these different diseases. Mm-hmm. And so the mitochondria are absolutely central to your health, and keeping them healthy is equivalent to keeping deuterium out. And that's something the cells know how to do. They do that very well, but they don't do it so well when they're exposed to toxic chemicals. That's the problem.
Yeah. And so deuterium, it can build up with us over time. Like maybe children, do they not have as much? And as we get older, the more exposures to things we have, the more foods we're taking in with deuterium, the more toxic our lifestyle is, the more we accumulate it. And even though, like you said, the body's getting rid of it, it can still build up almost like sludge in an engine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And in fact, what I'm really starting to believe, and this is speculation, you have all this crud that kind of accumulates in the body as you age. You think of the clogged arteries, right? Mm-hmm, the lipids that pile into the arteries and block the heart, and you end up with heart disease. You have the Alzheimer's plaque, and you have Lewy bodies associated with Parkinson's disease. So you have, and there's even a misfolded protein that accumulates in the pancreas associated with diabetes. There's all these conditions that involve sort of stuff piling up that looks like crud, really.
Yeah.
In the cells, in the tissues over time as you age. And my suspicion is that all of that stuff that's accumulating is actually trapping deuterium, that there's a whole mechanism by which the whole system is able to concentrate deuterium in stuff that then gets precipitated out and stored as junk, Mm-hmm. And so that junk just accumulates over time. And eventually, if your brain gets filled up with amyloid beta plaque, you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. So you're gradually piling away the deuterium, tucking it away in all these sort of gunky stuff, including the plaque that blocks the arteries. Mm-hmm. Eventually, that stuff is going to bite you. It's going to cause trouble, and you're going to be sick. Yeah. So it's just a matter of time as you accumulate more and more of it. Eventually, you basically get sick and die. And so there's a sort of measure of aging that has to do with how quickly you accumulate that stuff. Mm-hmm. And also which stuff you accumulate. And different people's genetics is going to dictate different solutions to the problem as far as where to put the deuterium. But it's all about trying to keep it away from the mitochondria.
Yeah. When you said Lewy body, it made me think I lost my grandmother to Lewy body. And, 10 years ago when that happened, it wasn't mainstream. And now you're hearing it a lot. You're hearing Lewy body a lot. You're hearing, like you said, Alzheimer's a lot. You're hearing all about, like what you said, these mitochondrial diseases. Are mainstream missing the boat here? Is it not just about, they're not eating right and exercising? Is it really more to do with this deuterium aspect and things like more of the mitochondria not getting what it needs in today's modern world?
Yeah, but it's really, eating right is super important, because eating right can mean keeping away from toxic chemicals. Mm-hmm. By eating organic, and that is incredibly important. I think the most important thing you can do to maintain good health is to get rid of glyphosate, for example, and all the other chemicals that are in the food supply. So you really have to buy certified organic when you shop, and that will be a big step towards improving your health, I believe.
And let's go there now then. So people might not understand, well, what is wrong with conventional? We've maybe heard about glyphosate, but maybe they don't understand what it is. And so talk about why we need to be paying attention to where our food's coming from and what's going on with it.
Yeah, so glyphosate is an herbicide, and because herbicides, they kill weeds, and there's several different herbicides, and they're all toxic. And most of the other ones, and many of them are chemical herbicides. There's a few sort of natural herbicides that are probably better, but still, anything that kills plants is going to hurt you too, because we have a lot in common with plants. Glyphosate kills all plants except for those that have been engineered to resist it by inserting a microbial gene, a special microbial gene, into the plant with the GMO technology. Mm-hmm. And we have our core crops in the United States: the corn, soy, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa. Those are all GMO engineered to resist glyphosate. So you can just spray glyphosate all over the plant. It doesn't die, but it does soak it up. And in fact, they spray it on wheat as well. It's not a GMO crop, but they spray it right before harvest on other crops that are not GMO, wheat and barley and oats. Oats are coming up with high levels of glyphosate contamination, like oatmeal or Cheerios. So there's glyphosate contamination widespread in our food supply, really widespread. Zen Honeycutt is the founder of Moms Across America. She's a good friend of mine. She's awesome. And she's been doing various studies testing the levels of glyphosate in various food samples. And she did a project with school lunches. She has the moms across America that she commissions her moms to go find, get some food, send it off, and they get it tested. And they did several food samples. I think on the order of 40, but I don't remember the number exactly, different food samples from the school lunches, and came up with something like 95% contamination with glyphosate. Wow. And then when she did fast foods out of the fast food restaurants, 100% contamination with glyphosate. So it is all over the food supply. It is by far the most used herbicide in this country and even in the world. And the US is a leader. We've been in there long and deep. We were among the first to start using glyphosate. And our government thinks it's so safe, they don't even bother to test it. They admit that it's all over the food supply, and they say it doesn't matter. But it's not true. So glyphosate is supposed to be a lot safer than its other alternatives, such as glufosinate or 2,4-D or dicamba. Those are all considered to be much more toxic than glyphosate. But I think that's a false assumption. I actually think glyphosate might be the most toxic of all of them. And the reason why we haven't figured that out is because when they designed the studies, they were very clever to avoid finding toxicity. This was way back in the 1970s. They managed to get the EPA to approve it. The industry, which is Monsanto at that time, still Monsanto, but Monsanto got bought by Bayer, so now it's Bayer who's in charge of glyphosate. They supposedly proved it was safe, but they didn't do the studies correctly, and they overlooked the fact, for example, that when you make the formulation, you put a lot of extra stuff in there that makes the glyphosate more toxic, more willing to be taken up by the plant. And it not only makes the glyphosate more toxic, but the other things in there are also very toxic in and of themselves. And they never studied it in combination with with the formulations. And they never studied the formulations either. What else is in the formulations? They never studied it. And their studies on animals were too short. They only went for 3 months. They had a rule: you only have to look for 3 months. If you don't see any problems, you're good to go. Glyphosate's a slow kill. And it kills by a unique, I believe, this is my theory, it kills by a unique mechanism that I talk about a lot in my book, Toxic Legacy. And that mechanism involves substituting for glycine by mistake during protein synthesis. So it's a very specific mechanism of toxicity unique to glyphosate. And that makes glyphosate a very unique poison in terms of what it does to your metabolism. And I've traced through and found particular proteins that have what I call a glyphosate susceptibility motif. I have a characteristic feature that I predict would be very susceptible to damage by glyphosate that would really wreck that protein. And I can give you a big list of proteins that would be affected. And I can show that many of them have actually been found to be suppressed by glyphosate. So there's a big sort of connect the dots project that I did that makes so much sense. And especially also looking at the diseases that are going up. We have a huge list of diseases that are going up dramatically. Obesity comes to mind, right? Diabetes, Alzheimer's disease. These diseases are all going up over time. Our country's in a mess as far as our health is concerned.
Sure.
And they're all going up exactly in step with the increased use of glyphosate on core crops. And of course, people say correlation doesn't mean causation, but I think it does. I think in this case, it's actually causation. And autism is one of them. And autism was what I was really keen to understand back in 2007 when I first started on this journey. And I really became very confident that glyphosate is a major factor in autism after hearing a presentation on glyphosate in 2012 by Professor Don Huber. That was such an eye-opener for me.
Wow, that's so fascinating that we are coming up in obesity and all these major diseases as the use of glyphosate comes up. So people really need to wrap their mind around that. I know last time we talked, you mentioned all of the foods that are prevalent, like you just said, oats and stuff like that are coming up as far as glyphosate content. But where are we now? Like, since you and I talked several years ago, where are we now? How much exposure, even outside of food? Like, it's in our water system, correct? Because I had to search
It
high
is.
and low to find a house filter that filters out glyphosate, but I was able
Yes.
to do so. But where are all the other sources coming from now that we're really inundated more so than ever in 2025 with this exposure?
Yeah. One thing I wonder about is whether we're getting it from the air, from the
Mm,
biofuels.
yes.
So we've been really pushing for biofuels to substitute for the coal and oil.
Hmm.
We're trying to reduce consumption of coal and oil. And
Hmm.
so one concept is to grow corn and then turn it into ethanol, and you have
Hmm.
ethanol that's added to the gasoline. That's pretty much widespread in the United States at this point, 5%, 10% ethanol in the gasoline. And that ethanol is derived from GMO Roundup Ready corn. And so that ethanol almost surely has glyphosate in it, and it'll evaporate even at that as you're filling your tank. The gas is evaporating. The glyphosate is probably evaporating along with the gas, and you can breathe it in the air, and it's
Hmm.
probably also escaping combustion. It can get burned up by combustion if it reaches combustion, but if you've got a poorly tuned engine, you have a bus that spews out a bunch of fumes, and you can really smell. They don't smell good.
Yeah.
I suspect that glyphosate is in the air, especially in the cities where they're using a lot of either biodiesel or bioethanol
Hmm.
in the fuel for all the cars and the trucks and the buses. I think we're breathing glyphosate in the air in that circumstance. And of course, also if you're near the fields where they're spraying glyphosate, you're going to definitely have it in the air.
Hmm.
I actually did Anthony Samsel's a friend of mine who's a toxicologist, and he did a project. He hasn't published it yet, but I'm hoping he will, where he had different people catch rain as it fell in various places around the world. And I sent him a sample of air from my office at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it came up positive for glyphosate. So it was the rain that came
Hmm.
out of the sky was contaminated with glyphosate, which to me means in fact, it's probably in the clouds. And it makes me wonder about the cloud bacteria, because I know there are bacteria in the clouds, and just like bacteria in the gut and bacteria in the soil play such an important role in making everything work properly,
Hmm.
it's my conjecture that bacteria in the clouds are actually very important for cloud formation and the whole way the weather works. So if they're being disrupted by glyphosate, you can bet money the weather's going to be messed up.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about that. I was just thinking about in our waterways, but also when you think about it, that waterway evaporates up into a cloud, and there's your toxicity right in the cloud as well. Not to mention, I'm a big watcher of the skies as far as like you can see them spraying the skies with
I
who knows
know.
what. And
Right.
most likely there's something in there. If people will look up and you see lines in the sky, that's not clouds.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly been a lot of interest in that lately, and the government looks like
Yeah.
they're getting interested in trying to figure that out and maybe
Hmm.
make corrections. It is some strange stuff that's going on up there that is being kept from us. We're not being explained what's going on, and we should be better informed.
So as far as like foods go, when we're talking like the highest amounts of glyphosate, are you seeing that more in fruits and vegetables or in meats? Like what would you say is going to be your highest exposures of glyphosate?
Wheat, oats, garbanzo beans, chickpeas,
Hmm.
hummus, for example.
Hmm.
Yeah, those are all, they're getting the highest levels of everything. And then of course also corn and soy,
Hmm.
sugars like beet sugar and cane sugar. Sugar cane is sprayed right before harvest. So it's in the sugars. It's in the honey, for example. There was an
Yeah.
interesting study on honey, and they had samples of honey from Mexico, from the United States, from Canada, and even I think from other places like Australia around the world. They had this big chart, and you could see, and each one was sort of labeled for which country it came from, and you could see this big section of U.S. honey that was much higher levels of glyphosate than all the rest, pretty much fully contaminated with glyphosate. The bees are just wandering around trying to eat flower, going to flowers, and the flowers are contaminated. I mean, it's just really a mess. And the bees are being killed too. I mean, we have this bee
Mhm.
colony collapse syndrome. I think it's caused by the glyphosate, primarily,
Mhm.
also the insecticides, but
Yeah.
glyphosate is a major factor in bee colony collapse.
Yeah, as a nutritionist, I've always advocated for gluten-free, and it used to be in my early days, I thought it was, everybody's just becoming sensitive to gluten, but Would you agree that it's most likely what they're spraying on the wheat that's causing these gut issues? And the same with oats. I've had people that ate oats all their lives, and now just recently they're going, every time I eat oats, I get bloated. So is this
Yeah.
something more to do with the glyphosate than the food itself?
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely the case. In fact, it's so interesting how many people, I never heard of gluten-free for most of my life, and then you
Right,
started seeing these gluten-free sections showing up in the grocery store, and it's like, what is this about? And now it's so common. Everyone, oh yeah, no, I don't touch wheat.
right.
It's so funny that people don't sort of step back and say, well, why now? Why is this such a problem now? And it wasn't before.
Mm-hmm,
And I'm pretty confident that it's glyphosate. And
mm-hmm,
glyphosate is the reason why wheat is not working anymore.
mm-hmm,
And I can even explain the mechanisms because glyphosate messes up the bacteria, and the bacteria that actually help the host to process the wheat, to metabolize the proteins in wheat,
mm-hmm.
those bacteria are very sensitive to glyphosate. So when glyphosate kills off those bacteria, the wheat doesn't get properly broken down, the wheat protein, the gluten, and it ends up with these peptides, these short peptides that are not broken down because of this disruption in the enzymes that the bacteria would be normally producing.
Mm-hmm.
And then those short peptides become allergenic. So when you have these sort of foreign peptides, and then glyphosate creates a leaky gut barrier as well.
Right, right.
So those foreign peptides escape into the circulation, and the immune cells, they're monitoring and say, oh my God, there's this foreign protein, and then they develop an antibody to it.
Mm-hmm,
And then there's a process called molecular mimicry by which that antibody starts attacking your own tissues, like your thyroid gland, for example.
mm-hmm.
So you get a lot of issues around antibodies that were developed against the proteins that did not get digested properly because the glyphosate messed up their gut microbiome. It's very clear to me. I've written, Anthony and I have a paper on glyphosate and gluten intolerance.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it makes total sense because, like you said, we're the country that does it the most, and I can go to Italy and I can have the wheat there, and it doesn't affect me. So I'm assuming maybe they're not spraying over there.
They much less, they don't really do the GMOs.
Mm-hmm.
So they have much less glyphosate in general.
Mm-hmm.
They do use glyphosate to kill weeds, but much, much less than we do. And in fact, Canada did a big study. They measured over 8,000 different food samples for glyphosate contamination. And then they trying to think of the name of the person, Tony Mitra. Sorry, I had a bit of a moment there. Tony Mitra is a Canadian citizen who's originally from India, and he was an activist, and he just kept harassing the government for many years to finally get them to do this. And then he published a book called "Poison Foods of North America," which it's a dry book. It has all the data about all the different numbers that they found in these 8,000 food samples. It's very interesting to look at that because it turns out that the United States and Canada stood out on average as having much higher levels of glyphosate in the food samples than the ones that were sourced from either Europe or from Mexico. Mexico came out more in line with Europe. So it's ironic. We always think Mexican food, they don't, they're not as careful. You sort of worry about Mexican food. We shouldn't be. We should be buying Mexican food because it's healthier.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Now, what about meat? Because I read that things like glyphosate, even if the field is sprayed and the cow's eating the grass that's been sprayed, they have the stomachs that are able to somehow break some of it down before it's digested into their body. So if somebody does more of a meat-based approach, are they getting less exposure to glyphosate or no?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer, actually. It'd be a good thing to find out. I think glyphosate accumulates in collagen, and so
Okay.
collagen is in muscle. So when you're eating meat, you're getting a lot of collagen, and collagen has a huge amount of glycine, so it has the potential to accumulate glyphosate in the collagen.
Mm.
And in fact, Anthony measured glyphosate. He got a sample of a horse hoof from a horse that died of founder. Founder is a problem with the hooves.
Hmm.
And he found high levels of glyphosate in the hoof, and the hoof has lots of collagen. So it's conceivable. There've also been studies, like there was a study on deformed piglets. Europe, there was let's say Eve Peterson. Peterson is his last name. Not sure about his first name, but he was a pig farmer, and he published a study on his piglets. He had piglets that were deformed, and they couldn't live. They were so badly deformed, and they tested their tissues for glyphosate. And they found the highest level, I think, in the lungs, which is interesting because we don't eat the lungs, so that's good, right?
Mm.
But they did find glyphosate in the tissue samples of these piglets, so it is accumulating in the tissues,
Okay.
which of course is worrisome. But my guess would be that if you're eating animal-based products, it's second tier, right? Because the glyphosate is sprayed directly on the plants.
Right.
So when you're eating the plants, you're probably going to get more glyphosate than if
Okay.
you're eating the animals that are derived from the plants. And like you say, cows have very sophisticated gut microbiome,
Hmm.
really fancy. They can eat grass and we can't, which is why I think it's a really good idea to put cows out on the grass. I really am
Yeah.
an advocate for cows on the grass because um, we can't eat grass. And there's lots and lots of land that's grasslands. It's easy to have grass, even in places which are suboptimal for growing crops. Grass does well. And grass also helps to capture carbon and put it into the soil. And when you have cows on the grass, they provide a natural fertilizer with the manure. And then they eat the grass, which stimulates it to grow. And so you get more carbon capture in the soil.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot to like about putting cows on the grass,
Mm-hmm.
converting grass into food that is actually delicious, especially, of course, all the dairy products. I love
Yeah.
dairy.
Yeah.
And of course, many people are sensitive to dairy. And that's because, again, it's got the same problem. Casein and gluten both have a lot of proline, and proline is an amino acid that's difficult to break apart.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you require those specialized enzymes from the microbes that get killed by the glyphosate. So
Yeah.
both proline and casein are troublesome when you've got glyphosate killing off those important microbes.
That's so fascinating. Yeah, I love your idea about like creating more cows on grass. It should be the way we go anyway. But yeah, I had read that maybe their stomachs were able to over and over process out some of that glyphosate. So it'd be interesting to find out if that's the case. So
Right,
when
because
it comes,
they have a lot of microbes, because they have
yeah.
that whole special thing with their stomach, and the microbes, quite possibly they could have some that can break it down. I think that's likely. I should see if I can figure that out. There aren't
Yes,
many
please
microbes that can
do.
break glyphosate down. One category where I know some species in Acetobacter in that group, Acetobacter can break
Yeah.
down glyphosate, which makes me hope that probiotics might contain Acetobacter that could break down glyphosate. That's really, really great. If you can get your gut populated with microbes that can break it down, you've got a really good situation for protecting yourself,
Yeah,
that's ideal.
that was one of my questions is I want to get to the how people can get the glyphosate out. But before we go there, so now we can marry the two topics we were talking about, deuterium and glyphosate. So is the deuterium level getting higher and higher in the body because of this glyphosate exposure? And what's the mechanism there?
Yeah, exactly right. And that is so interesting. This is where I got really excited. In fact, when I first heard about deuterium and its connection to toxicity, which I wasn't aware of until December 2019, when Laszlo Boros sent me a blind email and he congratulated me on a paper that Greg Nye and I had written. And then he said, "Oh, by the way, deuterium, do you know about deuterium?" And I'm like, "No." So we started a correspondence and we did some Zoom interactions, and then he and I have become good friends. And so we share a lot of, we're all trying this little core group that's trying to figure these things out. And he's part
Yeah.
of that. He's an important part of that group. And so when he said that, and then I looked, and he attached a paper that he had written, which was really fascinating about metabolism and about deuterium and how the body manages it in the way that metabolism works. And so I dove right in because I realized that right away that glyphosate would be a problem for deuterium. And that really excited me. So it was sort of an epiphany when that happened. And I've been studying deuterium like crazy ever since then. And as you know, it's publishing several papers. I've had
Yeah.
some good success in getting these papers published.
Yeah.
And so what's happening, I think, is it's really, really interesting how the gut microbiome works to support the host. And a crucial thing is that it provides the host with short chain fatty acids. And that's acetate, butyrate, and propionate, those three short chain fatty acids that are made by the gut microbes. And they make them from other fruits like sugar, for example. And so, and also fiber, so when you eat a lot of fiber, the microbes break down the fiber. Some of the microbes break it down into small organic molecules. And then other microbes yank hydrogen off of those organic molecules to make hydrogen gas. And then that hydrogen gas is used to reduce carbon dioxide into other organic molecules. And that includes these short chain fatty acids. So there's a whole system. And you get a lot of bloating and gas. And I mean, there's a lot of gas going on in the gut microbiome. There's a reason for that. It's a whole process to distill out the deuterium. It's so interesting to me. So the microbes make this hydrogen gas that's 80% depleted in deuterium. It's really remarkable. And the thing is that deuterium is heavier, so it tends to stay in the liquid phase. It doesn't come out as easily. And then the enzyme is also specialized to avoid deuterium. And so the combination of those two things, these hydrogenases that these microbes have, make the hydrogen gas they get rid of a lot of the deuterium when they do that. And then when they combine the hydrogen gas with carbon dioxide to make organic molecules, those organic molecules are also low in deuterium because they got the hydrogen from that hydrogen gas. And that's crucial. That whole process is crucial. And that's why you have hydrogen gas, you have methane, you have hydrogen sulfide, all those gases that are produced by the gut microbes are low in deuterium. And then they're brought back in to become organic matter that can actually be metabolized by the mitochondria. And the mitochondria are getting low deuterium nutrients that way. So those short chain fatty acids, especially butyrate, and there's a lot of papers on butyrate. You can search the web, you can find a lot of stuff on butyrate. Butyrate is God. I mean, it is so important to the colonocytes. They love it. And it's a low deuterium nutrient, and it'll keep them healthy. And when they don't have enough butyrate, they get sick. And then you end up with inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, bowel cancer, get colon cancer, all these things as a consequence, I think, of insufficient butyrate, on top of other problems that glyphosate causes. But that's a crucial part, I think, of the story.
Okay, good. And you mentioned Dr. Laszlo Borez, and you have another paper with him where you guys talk about the human deutenome. Can you explain to the listeners what the human deutenome is?
Yeah, that's sort of it's like you have the microbiome and the proteome. So the deutenome, you can imagine, is kind of the whole deuterium system, and how deuterium is managed in the body. And I think it's really quite fascinating. And one thing I will say is that I believe that the sulfated glycosaminoglycans are an important player in keeping deuterium out of the mitochondria. And so this becomes very interesting. Gerald Pollack has done a lot of work on the glycocalyx and how the gelled water, about Gerald's work on gelled water. And so you have gelled water lining all the blood vessels, and in the sulfates are sprinkled throughout those. It's a heparin sulfate, a complicated sugar chain that covers all the blood vessels. And the sulfates are really important for keeping the water gelled. And when the water is gelled, it creates a battery and it pushes protons out into the blood. And then the gel becomes negatively charged. And Gerald Pollack has said that's an engine driving the metabolism of the cells. Like you're getting a battery, so it's sort of like a solar panel. It's solar energy, and you can actually charge a battery up by getting out in the sun. And he showed that the exclusion zone water, which is the gelled water, the amount of it grows in response to sunlight. And so that is really interesting, that somehow it's able to use electricity that it gets from the sunlight to grow the gel. And that gelled water is pushing out protons into the blood, and those protons are not likely to be deuterons. And that's very simple math, because when you have a deuterium, you have water, H2O, right? So when you have a deuterium in there, you're going to have HDO. It'd be highly unlikely to have two deuteriums on one oxygen, but you could have D2O. But mostly you'd have HDO whenever there's a deuterium atom. And when you have HDO and H2O will break apart into H plus and OH minus, right? Those two, it breaks apart into H plus and OH minus, and H plus is the proton, and the proton escapes, so when you have this gelled water, you've got these OH minuses hanging around inside the gel and these H pluses, but the H pluses are leaving. And so you've got more OH minuses, but you have OD minus inside the cell, inside the gel, and H plus leaving. So when you have HGO, the D hangs on. It's like a magnet. It hangs on more strongly to the oxygen. So it doesn't let go. It's the H that lets go most of the time. And so what's pushed out is protons, not deuterons. And that makes the blood have low deuterium. Do you see that?
Yeah.
It's really a great system. So you have all this gelled water lining, all the blood vessels, all of it's pushing out these protons. And now the blood, what's circulating in the blood is low in deuterium. So I think that's a very, very important mechanism to keep the deuterium levels low in the blood, which then the blood supplies the protons to the mitochondria ultimately. And that's going to be low deuterium because the deuterium is trapped outside the cell in the gel.
While you're talking about this, I'm thinking about all the people with like chronic fatigue or this epidemic, if you will, of people that are like, I'm tired, I'm tired, I'm tired all the time. I'm just so tired. And then I can't sleep at night. And then I wake up tired. And I'm wondering if this really is more of like this deuterium buildup, this sludge in their system, this mitochondrial deficiency that's going on. And obviously, by lessening glyphosate exposure, we can help that. But let's now shift gears into what more they can do. You mentioned one of my favorite things, which is sunlight. For the human Deutenome is like, yes, all parts of the human body need sunlight. So that's huge. What else is going to help us get rid of this sludge so that people can start feeling better?
Certainly get rid of glyphosate. So try
Yeah.
as best you can to avoid glyphosate,
Hmm.
and buying certified organic at the grocery store. Luckily, there's more and more certified organic available even at the common, big grocery
Hmm.
stores. I feel like I've really seen a trend
Hmm.
towards greater availability of or certified organic foods. That's super important.
Hmm.
And then another thing is, of course, I said probiotics, which can help to keep your gut healthy.
Hmm.
Eating foods that have live bacteria in them,
Hmm.
and then sulfur. So sulfur for the sulfate. And I've talked a lot in my book about sulfur and how glyphosate disrupts the whole sulfur system.
Hmm.
Glyphosate interferes with the process that populates the glycocalyx with sulfates. And so you end up with systemic sulfate deficiency as a consequence of that. And many people have sulfur sensitivity. They can't really eat foods that contain sulfur.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's also, I think, a consequence of glyphosate messing up the enzymes that normally would metabolize sulfur correctly. Because sulfite is very reactive. And normally you would convert it to sulfate, and then you would activate the sulfate, and then you would attach it to something.
Hmm.
So the body attaches in the gut. Sulfate is attached to all kinds of biologically active molecules, and sulfation helps them to become solubilized. So many of
Hmm.
these molecules are rings, and they're not fat. They're fat soluble rather than being water soluble. And when you stick a sulfate on them, they become more able to go out into the water-based blood and circulate freely. And so the body uses that mechanism of attaching sulfate to things to support their transport in the blood. And these things include all the steroids like cholesterol and vitamin D
Hmm.
and all the sex hormones, and a lot of things are sulfated for the purpose of transporting them, and also all the aromatics that come out of the shikimate pathway, which glyphosate blocks.
Hmm.
And those aromatics include, you have the aromatic amino acids, tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. They're all sulfated before they're shipped around.
Hmm.
And then their derivatives, which are serotonin, melatonin, all these hormones and neurotransmitters, they're sulfated. They're sulfated before they're shipped out in the blood. So that sulfation process is super important for delivery of all these biologically important molecules. If you can't add sulfate to them, you can't deliver them, and then they become deficient throughout the
Hmm.
body. And that's a part that I talked about in my book about glyphosate disrupting the availability of these incredibly important molecules because of disrupting the sulfation system. And then you
Hmm.
become sensitive to sulfur containing foods, so you avoid them, then you get sulfur deficiency, and you don't have enough sulfate in your glycocalyx, and now you've got deuterium problems. So I think that's a direct hit.
Yeah, so it's not just as simple as somebody using sulfur, right? Like there's got to be a gentler way to do it. So what do you recommend?
Well, one thing you can do too, if you have sulfur sensitivity, is to soak in Epsom salt baths, and I highly
Hmm.
recommend that. Or
Yeah.
even just a foot bath with Epsom salt.
Hmm.
Epsom salts. Epsom salts is a magnesium sulfate,
Hmm.
and magnesium is probably good for you too. So it's a good way to
Yeah.
get magnesium as well. And taking magnesium can be problematic because it can cause diarrhea.
Hmm.
So you can get both magnesium and sulfate from an Epsom salt bath, which I do frequently actually. So I really
Yeah.
recommend that. And you can also drink deuterium depleted water, and this is
Yeah.
this is deuterium depleted water right here. I drink it
Nice.
every day. So I really believe in it. It's expensive. It's super expensive.
It
And I'm
is.
hoping the price would go down if it becomes more popular.
Yeah.
We don't make it in the United States so far. We have to import it from Russia. So
Yeah.
that's kind of problematic. So
Yeah. I don't know if people go for this, but there's a digital drugs or infoceuticals, how you put frequency in water with this infopathy.com that I use. And so they have a frequency for deuterium depleted water. So we're on the fence, like, am I really getting deuterium depleted when I put the frequency in? Because like,
oh,
is it
that's
going to actually
interesting.
lower it or is it going to match the frequency of deuterium depleted water? But I will say, every time I drink the water, I feel better. So
That's
it could be
interesting. Yeah.
placebo, but we'll see because
Yeah.
I'm doing all I can to lower my deuterium. I eat mostly meat, and I know you've talked about ketogenic diet, so maybe that's another
Lots of
thing we can talk
animal-based
about.
fats is
Yes.
important, yes,
Yeah.
and saturated fats.
Hmm.
Saturated fats have gotten a bad rep, and it's not deserved because they are not reactive. You know, the polyunsaturated fats are very important.
Hmm.
Have very important roles to play, especially in the brain, but they're very sensitive to oxidation damage. And when you've got those broken mitochondria, watch out, you know, because it's going to mess up your polyunsaturated fatty acids.
Hmm.
And when
Hmm.
you eat saturated fat, your body can actually turn it into unsaturated fat. You know, it can desaturate it. So it's not like it can't become
Hmm.
unsaturated, you know.
Yeah. So we've talked about, less of the glyphosate containing foods, more of a ketogenic animal fats and sunlight and deuterium depleted water. What else? I know even
Maybe
in,
hydrogen water. Hydrogen
yeah,
water
I
is
wanted to
something
talk
quite
about
interesting.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I suspect that it has the same property that the hydrogen
Okay.
gas is low in deuterium, and that your body's able to use it because it's just like it's similar to the hydrogen gas that was made by the microbes. When you drink
Mhm.
it, you know, you basically get this thing going, and the reaction bubbles, and you're drinking the
Yeah.
hydrogen before it goes away because it'll just evaporate if you let it sit. So
Right.
you have to kind of do it quickly as it reacts, you know, and produces the hydrogen gas. My guess is that that hydrogen gas is also depleted in deuterium,
Mhm.
and that the microbes know how to turn it into short chain fatty acids, for example. And so, therefore, I remember when I heard a talk on hydrogen gas many years ago at a Weston Price Foundation Wise Traditions meeting.
Yeah.
And this woman gave she was very enthusiastic about hydrogen gas and hydrogen water. And I was like really skeptical, you know. I'm like, I don't get this. It's interesting how you can change your mind after you learn more, you
Oh
know,
yeah.
because once I realized this significant role of hydrogen gas in the gut, then I thought, oh, well, maybe that's why, you know, and that
Hmm.
makes sense now that hydrogen gas could be very important in the gut to help out those microbes that are not able to make as much as they should because the microbes that make the hydrogen gas are getting affected by the glyphosate.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so as far as like the hydrogen, like if I'm hearing you right, if we are drinking hydrogen water, it's most likely that we are getting deuterium depletion as
Yeah,
well.
and someone should prove that because I think the experiment could be done by someone who has a proper lab to see if the hydrogen gas that's produced by these chemical methods is also severely depleted. I would guess that it would be because deuterium stays with the liquid phase. You know, deuterium always it stays with the gel instead of going into the liquid. It stays with the
Hmm.
ice instead of going into the water. When you drink glacier water, that's low in deuterium.
Hmm.
So deuterium tends to stay behind in the heavier phase, which makes sense because it binds more strongly
Hmm.
to oxygen, for example. Like I said, when you break HDO up, you break it up into OD minus and H plus, and then the H plus is going to be low in deuterium, you know, because you won't have it'd be unlikely to have OH minus and D plus. It's
Hmm.
unlikely to have that, and that's why you end up with less hydrogen, less deuterium in the gas phase than in the, and that's the same with water. I suspect actually, you know, waterfalls. I found a paper that talked about hanging out next to waterfalls as
Oh,
being therapeutic.
that's
And they were
awesome.
talking about the waterfalls releasing some kind of, they thought maybe some kind of products from the mist, you know, but
Yeah.
it's actually quite simple, I think, because the product is deuterium depleted water.
Mhm.
Because again, the water tends to stay with the liquid, the deuterium stays with the liquid phase. So when you have the mist that's coming off of the waterfall, it's
Mm.
more likely to be H2O rather than HDO because it's
Mhm.
lighter, you know, it's
Oh,
easier
yeah.
for it to leave. And so when you breathe, and that's the same with the ocean waves, if you're breathing the air, walking along the ocean shore with a lot of waves, you're probably picking up deuterium depleted water as you breathe, which I find really interesting, intriguing as an
Mhm.
idea. So again, that says I support the idea of walking in the water along the ocean's edge, especially if the ocean is stormy. It's also fun, of course, but it's
Yeah.
it's a very potentially a way to breathe in deuterium depleted water.
Well, there's another reason why we feel so good in nature, right? Just the ocean, the water, the waterfall, like you mentioned. I mean, it's not just because you're out of the office. It's actually there's some medicinal purposes going on in your
Yeah,
body.
I've heard this medicinal medicines in the air when you're in a forest, because the trees
Hmm.
are releasing various interesting molecules that you could be
Yeah,
breathing in and could be beneficial. So of course you
absolutely.
can get pollen, you can get sort of allergies as well, but that's an interesting problem. But yeah, being in nature feels like it's so much better. And of course the air is usually cleaner too. If you're in a sort of natural setting, the air is cleaner,
Yeah.
unless it's been sprayed with glyphosate.
Oh, yeah, no kidding. We're still breathing it as far as we know. So, but the
Yeah.
point is that we've got this bucket and we don't want to let the deuterium bucket fill up in our body. So, by doing these
Yes.
things, and in one of your works, you said these natural therapies of like naturally low in deuterium foods like animal fats and a ketogenic diet and hydrogen water and sunlight, all of these things will keep that bucket from overflowing and causing more toxicity in the body. And one of your papers in relation to now, as we shift gears into cancer cells, because cancer is so
Yes.
prevalent, cells evolve into tumor cells under conditions where their mitochondria are overloaded with deuterium. So it's important that my listeners hear what you have to say about the importance of ridding the body of deuterium when it comes to cancer prevention, because now it's like 1 in 2 of us, right?
I
Where every
know.
other person is getting some form of cancer.
Yeah, cancer was the first thing that I started to look at. I suspected that cancer might be a consequence of deuterium toxicity, and I'm quite convinced now that that's the case. And I've published a peer-reviewed paper now. It was
Mm-hmm.
originally a preprint, but it's now peer-reviewed, all about cancer and deuterium, and it's so fascinating because the
Mm-hmm.
cancer cells, first of all, they they're and people talk about cancer being a metabolic disease. That's catching on. It used to be, oh yeah, it's just genetic mutations, in the mitochondrial DNA, and then that causes it to become a rogue cell. It was kind of, they were looking at the mutations, and concentrating on that instead of looking at sort of metabolic dysfunction,
Mm-hmm.
which is the real problem. The cancer cells change their metabolic policy in a big way, and what they do is they take in massive amounts of sugar and they convert it into lactate, and then they release the lactate into the circulation. And then they have all these, in many cases, some of them have mitochondria that are broken because they do get DNA damage, and that's because the mitochondria have got too much deuterium, so they're releasing reactive oxygen. The reactive oxygen changes the DNA, because it attacks the DNA. The DNA mutates, and you do have that whole problem happening in cancer, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
consequence of the deuterium. The deuterium causes an increase in the reactive oxygen coming out of the mitochondria, which then kills the DNA, and then
Mm-hmm.
you get the mutations, and then eventually you can get into a situation where the cancer cell changes its metabolic policy in a huge way. And it's really fascinating what it can do, because it basically says, okay, and in many cases it has mitochondria that are still fine, they're functioning, but it doesn't use them to make energy, even though they work. It doesn't. That's puzzled people why they don't use their mitochondria. But the reason why they're not using them is because they've got too much deuterium in them. And in a sense, the cell is smart, and it knows that if I use my mitochondria to make energy, I'm going to create reactive oxygen that's going to kill me. So I better not do that. So instead, they get all their energy from glucose glycolysis, which is this process that takes place in the cytoplasm. The glucose comes in and gets converted. They convert it to lactate and they ship it out. So they just pull a little bit of ATP out of that process. Every time they take a sugar molecule, turn it into lactate and release it, they get a little bit of ATP, much less than you would get from the mitochondrial. If you were to fully metabolize the glucose in the mitochondria, you get a lot more. But they just use a lot of glucose. So
Mm-hmm.
eventually they get enough energy out of that process, and they make a ton of lactate and they ship the lactate out. And the lactate is actually a deuterium depleted nutrient that it supplies. The cancer cell supplies it to the immune cells. So the fascinating thing to me is that the immune cells actually swarm into the cancer environment. A tumor typically has lots of immune cells there. And the frustration is they don't attack the cancer. And the cancer actually releases signals to tell them to stand down. And so these immune cells are there, but they're not killing the cancer like they should be. But meanwhile, they're happy to have all that lactate, which is helping to solve their mitochondrial problem. So I
Right.
think that cancer is collaborating with the immune cell, where the cancer is sort of sacrificing its own mitochondria and piling up deuterium, and then releasing lactate, which is a deuterium depleted fuel, but they also release protons. So what's really fascinating is the cancer cells have these, all the cells have these, ATPase pumps. I talked about the ATPase pumps
Mm-hmm.
that use the proton motive force from the hydrogen from the protons as the energy to make the ATP. But there's another kind of ATPase that works in reverse. It actually converts ATP to ADP, losing that ATP. And in doing so, it's able to push protons out against a proton gradient. So those ATPase pumps, normally they circle around the lysosomes, and they're used to push protons into the lysosomes. The lysosomes are the digestive, the digestive system of the cell. Right. Is the lysosome. It needs to be very acidic. It has to have a lot of protons. And so these ATPase, alternative reverse kind of ATPase pumps, if you will, they pump protons against the gradient and use energy to do so. In other words, there's already more protons inside where they're trying to push protons in. And they have to burn the ATP to do that. And they concentrate the ATP in the lysosome, which makes it really acidic, which then allows to break down stuff, debris, basically. But the cancer cells take that same ATPase that's supposed to push protons into the lysosome, and they push it outside the cell. They actually ship protons out into the environment with these ATPase reverse pumps. And those protons that it's shipping out are extremely depleted in deuterium, because those pumps have been shown to have what they call a very high deuterium kinetic isotope effect. That means they won't push deuterons out. They only push out protons. So the cancer cell is sitting there pushing out these deuterium depleted protons into the environment and pushing out and dumping out all this lactate into the environment. And the immune cells are swarming in, and they're like, thank you so much. Thank you, God, you saved me, because they're getting this low deuterium water, from those protons that are coming in, and they're getting this low deuterium nutrient with the lactate. And that's helping them to heal. So I think the cancer cells, the immune cells, are attracted to the cancer because it's a place to heal. And they're trying to solve their own mitochondrial problem. And the cancer is helping them to do that. And if the cancer can support them enough such that they can recover and get healthy, then they can clear the cancer. So it's only until the cancer grows big enough to solve the problem of the local immune cells, to get them powered up to work, that they can kill the cancer, which is ironic because it kind of says you have to let the cancer grow in order to get rid of it. You have to let it grow first, which is really scary to think about, but that's really, really interesting to me. So I think that some people get cancer as a consequence of this deuterium toxicity problem as a solution. And it's a kind of solution to try to fix the immune cells. And the immune cells are very important, they're super important in the body, and they're sick. And they're sick because of this mitochondrial dysfunction that's due to too much deuterium. So the body has to come up with different ways to solve that problem. And one of the ways to solve it is to have cancer.
Yeah, and your paper was cancer, deuterium, and gut microbes too. So the gut microbes, we go back to that now, which I'm assuming would have a start with the glyphosate, destroying those or having the improper gut microbes in there that then have the perfect breeding ground for something like a cancerous cell, yeah?
Exactly. Colon cancer is one of the cancers that's going up, and also liver cancer, pancreatic cancer, they're all going up exactly instead. Pancreatic cancer matches very well with glyphosate usage. Glyphosate is really hard on the pancreas. And partly because it's just in that system, with glyphosate's coming into the gut and it gets into the liver and the pancreas, and they both get sick because of the glyphosate. And I think it's a direct consequence of the deuterium overload that's causing these cancers: colon cancer, pancreatic cancer, liver cancer. All as a consequence of excess glyphosate exposure and then excess deuterium in the mitochondria. I think that's central to those problems. Yeah. So in the paper, we didn't talk about glyphosate at all, because I've strategized to see that if I leave glyphosate out, I'm much more likely to get the paper accepted. It's really sad. So I'm playing this game right now of writing all about deuterium without mentioning glyphosate, even though glyphosate's the elephant in the room, so to speak,
Yeah, you can kind of pick up on it whenever you're reading it. Like when I read it, I'm like, I know what she's talking about in the background.
Yeah,
but that's just because you're so passionate about it, as you should be, because these are things people aren't talking about. They're not talking about this. Like you said, the elephant in the room is really deuterium, that we have to get the load down. And I just want to bring up another paper that you have on taurine, because you said taurine prevents mitochondrial dysfunction and protects mitochondria from those reactive oxygen species you were talking about and deuterium toxicity. So my question is, since taurine is an amino acid in animal protein, would this be another avenue that could potentially deplete deuterium toxicity and aid in cancer prevention too?
Absolutely.
So we shouldn't
absolutely. I
fear
love
meats
taurine.
when we're in
No, I
Cancer.
think taurine is super important. And when you eat, when you're a strict vegetarian, you basically get no taurine unless you
Right,
eat a lot of seaweed. Seaweed is
right.
the only vegetable that contains taurine, which is
Mhm,
pretty amazing. And taurine is a really interesting amino acid. It has a sulfonate
mhm,
attached to it, and that's what makes it special.
mhm,
The only amino acid that has a sulfonate, and sulfonate is almost sulfate. It just needs one more oxygen to become
mhm,
sulfate. Only human cells don't know how to convert it to sulfate, but the microbes do,
mhm.
and the microbes convert taurine to sulfate as a very powerful way to supply the whole efficiency is really, I think, a systemic problem with the glyphosate, especially because I think glyphosate disrupts that ability of the microbes to make the sulfate from taurine. There's a lovely paper on E. coli that talks about enzymes that get suppressed by glyphosate in E.
Mhm.
coli. It's a big list. They have a big table. And taurine transporters were severely suppressed by glyphosate. Those are the things that pull the taurine into the microbe
Mhm.
so that it can convert it to sulfate. So the transporters are severely suppressed by glyphosate, which suggests to me that they can't turn it into sulfate, and so they keep it out. And so I think that's a serious problem. So when you're eating taurine, you need to have low glyphosate, which is another issue. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's really fascinating. And of course, taurine also attaches to the bile acids, and so the liver attaches the taurine to the bile acids and sends it back to the gut,
Mhm.
and then the bile acids sort of hand the taurine over to the microbes on a silver platter. They sort of allow I think they anchor the taurine in the membrane of the microbe, which then allows the enzymes to get at it. So it's very fascinating how the human cells collaborate with the microbes to get the job done. You know, there's many examples like that where they collaborate.
It is
Quite
fascinating
fascinating.
when you when you just sit and ponder on how the body has like amazing pathways for everything. And really, if we get out of the way and we do our bodies a service of getting back to nature, we can
Yes,
actually do a lot of healing on those pathways and get out of the way. The body knows how to heal, but you can't keep infiltrating it with all these non-native sources of substance, right?
exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, glyphosate is not the only chemical out there. There's a lot of other stuff. And many of the insecticides are very toxic, the fungicides and
Mhm.
the other herbicides are all supposed to be much more toxic than glyphosate. So we've really got a mess of stuff on our food. We need to go back to certified organic farming. That's what we need to do. And I'm hoping that RFK Jr. will uh, encourage that process
Yeah,
by subsidizing the organic farms,
for sure.
subsidizing the transition to organic, because that's costly. When this farmer's been using chemicals for many years, he's got soil that's contaminated. He can't just switch on a dime and become organic. You know, he's got to go through a process, and that can take years. And during that
Mhm.
time, he can't sell his product as organic.
Mhm.
So he's really getting hit hard by the extra cost of not using all these chemicals, you know.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, his soil is sick, so he has to fix his soil before he can, because the chemicals are messing up the soil in a big way,
Mhm.
which is making the crops less robust. And then they have more sensitivity to insects. I mean, the whole thing is a cascade of horrors, you know. It's a horror show. And eventually we have to realize that we cannot grow food the way we're growing it right now. We have to
Yeah.
change.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a tough transition, but we have to do it. And I really hope Kennedy has the strength and fortitude to make it happen.
You're so passionate about deuterium depletion. Have you seen anything on the forefront about the deuterium depleted water becoming more mainstream? Like, are you helping research anything? Because it's so hard to make, and why is it so hard to make? I feel like we're living in the
Yeah.
21st century. Why don't they have a machine now that we can all have that makes deuterium depleted water?
I think we have to get more people interested in buying it to see
Okay.
that there's a demand. And then once there's a demand, then somebody in America will say, geez, I really should spend the money up front to get this machinery so I can do it.
Yeah.
I can make a killing because all these people want it. But until
Mhm.
people want it, it's not going to happen. So it's going to
Mm.
continue to be expensive for as long as we have to source it from Russia.
Do you have some companies you recommend?
Light water. That's
Light
the
water.
one I
Yeah,
always buy from.
that
Yeah.
makes sense. Yeah.
Drinklightwater.com. You can go there
Hmm.
and you can order it and they ship it. And I've been doing that for many years, actually.
Hmm. And you don't have
I
to drink a whole bottle at one time, right? Explain how you,
tiny amount,
yeah,
actually. All
tiny
I do,
amount.
and this is my thing right here, with about 1/3 cup of
Hmm.
light water and then 2/3 cup of regular water, because the light water is really light. It only
Yeah.
has 10 parts per million. It's
Hmm.
actually too strong in a way, too weak, you could say. It's sort of ironic that you want to get the deuterium out. So
Yeah.
you're buying water that's mostly not deuterium, and that's not, you'd never see it in nature. So it's not a natural kind of water. So
Hmm.
what I do is I make it into something like glacier water. Glacier
Hmm.
water has about maybe 100 to 110 parts per million compared to
Hmm.
155 in regular seawater, for example. So normal
Hmm.
water has around 155 parts per million. Glacier water has maybe around 110. It can get as low as 90, like in Antarctica, so it depends
Hmm.
on where you've sourced it. You can buy glacier water, and that would also be low in deuterium, but it's not nearly as low as the water I buy, which
Hmm.
is done chemically, and they can get it down to only 10 parts per million. So when you mix that very low with the regular water, you end up with something that's stimulating glacier water. And I
Okay.
just drink 1 glass a day.
And how long have you been drinking it?
Years. Well, ever since probably close to 2019. It took me a
Yeah.
while to convince myself that I needed to, and then probably, well, so 2020. So it's probably been 4 or 5 years.
And what have you noticed since you started doing it?
Well, I can't say that I've noticed anything. I mean, I'm generally very healthy, so
Hmm.
I stayed healthy.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I can't really say that I've noticed anything from it. It
Okay.
would be lovely if I could, but I don't really get sick, so
Yeah. Well, like
I
you
don't have
said,
any
you
aches and
you
pains,
you probably didn't have a lot of deuterium to begin with because you were doing
Yeah.
so many things to keep it at bay. So,
Right. I only buy certified organic when we shop. We do cheat when we go out to eat, but we don't go out to eat very often. So
and living in
it's hard to
Hawaii, that
find.
makes it pretty easy to eat organic.
Yes. And also, yeah, we live on the North Shore and there's all kinds of
Yeah.
organic farmers. It's really nice. We have the farmers market, and we're very fortunate where we
Yeah.
live. It's easy to stay healthy. Kauai is a beautiful island, and the North Shore is very big on organic and natural and all that sort of thing. The West
Yeah.
Side, not so much. They have a lot of chemical industry
Okay.
developing new GMOs. So there's a real kind of schizophrenic island with the fight between the North Shore and the West Side,
Hmm.
which is interesting. But
Okay, so as we wrap up here, I have one more question that I want to go over with you because if you're open to discussing something that's been kind of troubling me, you kind of talked about it earlier, but I, as a nutritionist, am seeing an alarming raise in people complaining of heart palpitations. You already mentioned Alzheimer's and dementias, strokes, more autoimmune than ever before, depression, sleep disorders, and to quote your Twitter feed, you resonated with what I've been noticing. So you said the researchers found alarming surges in several conditions, including ischemic stroke, hemorrhagic stroke, transient ischemic attack, myelitis, myasthenia gravis, which a lot of people don't know is a body weakness that is autoimmune in nature, Alzheimer's, cognitive impairment, depression, anxiety, and sleep disorders. So the reason for this rise is what?
well, I suspect the COVID-19 vaccines. Is that what you're expecting or not?
Yeah, sort of. But my other question was, is there glyphosate in that you know of?
No, I don't know. I don't know
Okay.
if there is, but I will say that both Anthony Samsel and my Zen Honeycutt, I mentioned both of them earlier, independently tested vaccines, childhood vaccines, several different ones for glyphosate, and they found a consistent story between the two sets of samples, which was that the live virus vaccines contained glyphosate.
Hmm.
The ones that had aluminum in them did not contain glyphosate, but the glyphosate was probably fed to the virus when it was grown in culture to maintain it.
Mm.
The nutrients that they provided for to grow the virus probably were contaminated with glyphosate. That's probably how it got in. But the MMR vaccine had by far the highest levels in both of those tests, both by Zen and by Anthony.
Hmm.
MMR had the highest levels, which is really interesting because MMR is the one that Andrew Wakefield targeted as the causal factor in autism. So it makes me think that injecting glyphosate is horrible. It's much, much worse than ingesting it. Just straight into the system without any
Hmm.
barriers. It doesn't have any possibility of being kept out. And I can't imagine combining glyphosate with all what else is in the vaccines, that's
Correct.
trying to induce an immune response. And then there's that glyphosate with it. I think it's really quite a horrific concept to think about what that might do. So I think that it's conceivable that the glyphosate in the vaccines is a causal factor in vaccine association with autism. I don't know to what extent the glyphosate is the causal ingredient or whether other things. I do think that the vaccines are a factor in autism. I definitely believe that's true. Exactly how, there's aluminum as well, and that's also very associated with autism. So, and of course, the whole thing of the immune cells, forcing the immune cells to do something abnormal, messing up the immune system. I definitely think the vaccines are causal in autism, but the COVID vaccine, I've studied that quite extensively, and it's a nasty thing. And that's a whole long story that we could do a whole podcast on. But I think the COVID vaccine is the reason why we're seeing all these conditions going up, with the heart palpitations and the myocarditis and all of these things, that neurological problems, cognitive problems. The COVID vaccine is extremely toxic. I never got any, and I would recommend anyone who's still getting them to stop at this point. They're not doing you anything good compared to what more damage that they're causing to your immune system. So
yeah, thank you for saying that. I had noticed an uptick in all of these from people coming to me saying the same things, all these different people saying the same things. And I'm like, this is not coincidence, like it's too much to be coincidence. And I have a family member that was a nurse in a hospital, and she was seeing the same things, like lots of heart palpitations and AFib and heart attacks and strokes, and blood clots, and all these things that were the same. And I was like, this isn't a coincidence. It can't be. Like, there's too much going on here. So, yeah.
Well, there's something really wild about the COVID vaccine that I'll just throw out there that's wild speculation. So I'm not saying it's true, but I do know that there's stuff on the web from companies that are promoting the idea of basically doping RNA with deuterium in order to help to protect it from being broken down. They're proposing it as a useful approach to creating sturdy RNA. And the vaccine, they obsessed on making sure the RNA was really sturdy. And so they could have doped it with deuterium without telling anybody, because deuterium is a natural isotope of hydrogen. Just because you have a lot more, you don't need to report it, So it's possible, it's a horrible thought, but it's possible that they actually do intentionally dope it with deuterium in order to strengthen the RNA's ability to resist getting broken down, because that's their whole point with that vaccine. They were so worried about it getting broken down. It would be a way to protect it from getting broken down, and it would be a way to introduce deuterium toxicity into the body. So it's a horrific thought, but I've toyed around with that idea, and I've never spoken publicly about it because it's so speculative. I'd love to know whether that's the case, because they're not going to tell you. If they did it, they're not going to tell you, I don't think.
Yeah, no,
so that's just kind of.
I appreciate your insights, because it's very common sense isn't that common anymore. So I can appreciate when somebody has a common logic thought that makes sense, even if it's not science. Sometimes logic and common sense rules. So
yeah, we can speculate. I do a lot of theorizing and speculating because I don't have a lab, so I just read and write. I study like crazy to figure things out, and then I have conjectures, and then I sort of build an empire, out of evidence that comes from all these different directions. So it's a fun puzzle, and I enjoy it. So it's fortunate that I get paid to do that.
Yeah, well, you're good at it, so keep it up, and we appreciate your passion and your fortitude for continuing to find answers for us. So, last question I like to ask my guests is, I love Audrey Hepburn's quote, "I believe that every day should have at least one exquisite moment." So can you share today what your exquisite moment is?
I guess it probably hasn't happened yet.
Okay, yeah, there's still time. Your day is earlier there, huh?
Yeah. Now, that's a
Maybe
tough one.
an example of yesterday's exquisite moment.
Exquisite moment. It is a nice thought. Gosh, that's a hard one to answer, though. I don't know. I have a nice lifestyle.
Yeah.
It's I guess I would say, actually, I typically get my cup of coffee in the morning, and then I sit outside in the sun at sunrise. I get up early, and as the sun is rising, and I'm sitting out there, the birds are singing, and that's an exquisite moment that I have almost every day.
I love that. I'm out there joining you. It's just probably a little earlier than you are because I'm, what, 5 hours ahead of you?
Yeah, right.
Well, this has been awesome, Stephanie. Where can people find your book? I know I kind of mentioned it, but maybe your website
Mhm.
as well. They can get it anywhere books are sold, but as far as your website, what would that be?
Yeah, I do have a website, stephanieseneff.net, and my book is listed there, and all
Mhm.
the various booksellers. I have links to various booksellers that sell it. You
Okay.
don't have to buy it at Amazon, but you can. And
Mhm.
Chelsea Green, I think you can get it directly from the publisher as well.
Okay. And anywhere else they should look to connect with you?
You can send me email. It's the best way,
Yeah.
which is Seneff at CSAIL, CSAIL, that's my lab, Computer Science Artificial Intelligence Laboratory .mit.edu.
Okay. Great. Well, we so appreciate your work and the things that you're doing and the time you took today to share all this with us. So
It's been
we'll
great.
have to
Thank
do it
you.
again for sure.
Yes, I have lots to share, and you're a great person to talk to because you're engaged and interested. And I love it when young people are involved because we need help from your generation to solve these problems.
Yeah, we're all in this together trying to put the pieces together to help people feel better. So, yeah.
Mhm.
All
Yeah.
right. Well,
All
thank
right.
you. We'll
Thank
see you
you.
soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, after much deliberating and decision making, I have some news to share. I've decided to run my consulting business on a pay what you want donation based approach. That's right, all my coaching calls, consultations, and even a couple of new services I've added are now a pay what you want fee. With how expensive everything is in the world, I don't think your health should be something that you can't afford to take care of. I love what I do, and working with clients on their health goals, it's my passion, and I don't want to let the cost of figuring out what's going on with your health to be the reason why you won't work on it with me. So, whether it's a 30-minute express coaching call, a full scale nutrition therapy consultation, one of my new lifestyle and habit forming coaching calls I offer, or my most exciting offer, breathwork coaching, it's all donation based. You can learn more or sign up at meetbodyandsoul.com/services. And listen, don't let any cost, anyone, anything hold you back from feeling better. You haven't come this far in life for you to only come this far. You can go farther, and I would love to be your coach and your cheerleader to help you get there.